The alarms in my pod were screaming before I even opened my eyes. Red light filled the tiny chamber. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the seat. Somewhere behind me, my home world was already gone, swallowed by distance and silence. I was alone in the dark, falling through space, with no one listening to my thoughts for the first time in my entire life. For my people, that silence was worse than any punishment. I am Ashari. We are not like humans. We do not speak with our mouths alone. Every Ashari mind is joined to every other Ashari mind through something called the Concord. From the moment we are born, our thoughts are shared. Our fears are shared. Our joys are shared. There is no such thing as a private thought among my people. There is no such thing as being alone. Until they cast me out. The pod shook again as it entered a debris field. I did not know where I was going. I did not know if I would survive the next hour. All I knew was that 3 days ago, I had a name that meant something. A place in the Concord. A mind that belonged to something larger than itself. Now I had nothing. My name is Vesa. I was born with a flaw. That is what the elders called it. My mind never synced completely with the others. I could feel their thoughts, yes. But there was always a gap. A space where something of me remained separate. The healers tried for years to close that gap. They failed every time. The elders called it noise. They said my mind made a sound that disturbed the harmony of the Concord, like a single wrong note in a song sung by an entire world. For years I tried to quiet myself. I trained. I meditated. I prayed to close the gap that made me different. Nothing worked. Then came the day I tried to save someone. His name was Tarn. He was young, younger than me, and his flaw was worse than mine. The elders had already begun the process to unweave him, to strip his name from the Concord and cast him into the void, alone, forever. I begged them to stop. I offered my own mind as proof that flawed Ashari could still serve the Concord, could still be useful, could still belong. They did not listen. Tarn was cast away before I could finish my appeal. I never learned what happened to him. Perhaps he drifted until his ship ran out of air. Perhaps he found some distant colony that took him in. I will never know. But my defense of him marked me. The elders decided that if I would fight the Concord's judgment once, I would fight it again. 3 days later, it was my turn. There was no trial the way humans understand trials. There was only a gathering of elders, their minds locked together in perfect agreement, judging me in a single unified thought. I felt their decision before any words were spoken. I felt my name being erased from the shared memory of my entire species. It is a strange thing, to feel yourself being forgotten by everyone who ever knew you, while you are still alive to feel it happen. They gave me a pod, minimal supplies, and pushed me into space. That is how I found myself drifting through a debris field, alarms screaming, gravity pulling me toward wreckage I could not steer around. I braced myself for the end. I thought that after everything, this was how it would finish. Not with the slow fading my people expected of exiles, but with a quick and violent stop against a piece of broken metal in the dark. Then something caught my pod. I felt the tug of a tractor beam before I understood what it was. My pod shuddered, spun once and steadied. Through the cracked front window, I saw a ship unlike anything from my world. It was rough, patched together, clearly built for hard work rather than beauty. Lights blinked along its hull in a pattern I did not recognize, and painted across its side, in letters I could not yet read, was a name. The ship was called the Wandering Light. I did not know at the time that this ship, and the people on it, would change everything I believed about myself, about my people, and about what it means to be alone. The tractor beam pulled me into a docking bay. My pod settled with a heavy clang against the deck. I sat frozen, unsure what would happen next. Every story I had ever heard about outsiders capturing exiled Ashari ended badly. Some said outsiders studied us like specimens. Some said they sold us as curiosities. Some said they simply destroyed anything they did not understand. I prepared myself for the worst. The pod door hissed open. Cold air rushed in, carrying smells I had never known, metal and fuel and something warm I could not name. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against bright light. I could not see his face at first, only his shape, tall and steady, watching me with no weapon raised. "Easy," he said. His voice was calm, low, unhurried. "You're safe. Nobody here is going to hurt you." I did not understand his words at first. My translator implant, damaged in the crash, sparked and struggled to catch up, but something in his tone reached me before the words did. It was not the tone of someone preparing to hurt me. It was the tone of someone trying not to frighten an animal caught in a trap. I raised my hands, though I do not know what I expected that gesture to accomplish. He raised his own hands in return, palms open, showing me he carried nothing dangerous. "My name is Colin," he said slowly. "Colin Hale. Can you understand me?" My translator caught up just enough to make sense of the last few words. I nodded, though the motion felt unnatural to my body, still trembling from the crash and from 3 days without the Concorde's presence in my mind. "Good," he said, and something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to one. "That's good. What's your name?" I hesitated. On my world, a name was not simply a name. It was a thread connecting you to the Concorde, to every other mind that had ever spoken it, thought it, shared it. My name had already been erased from that web. Saying it now, to a stranger, in a place with no Concorde at all, felt like speaking into an empty room and hoping someone would answer. "Vesa," I said finally. My voice cracked on the single syllable. It was the first time I had spoken aloud since my exile began. "Vesa," Colin repeated, careful with the sound, as if testing whether it was fragile. "All right, Vesa, let's get you out of that pod and somewhere warm." He extended a hand toward me, not grabbing, not pulling, simply offering. I stared at it for a long moment. On my world, physical touch between strangers was almost unheard of. We did not need it. Our minds touched instead. But here, in this cold metal room, with no Concorde to connect us, his hand was the only bridge being offered. I took it. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped me step out of the pod. My legs shook beneath me, weak from the crash and from days of fear. He did not let go until he was certain I could stand on my own. Then he stepped back, giving me space, watching me with careful eyes but no judgment in them. Behind him, I noticed 2 others had entered the bay. A woman with short dark hair stood near a control panel, her posture tense but not hostile. A man with tools still clipped to his belt leaned against the far wall, watching me with open curiosity rather than fear. "That's Dana," Colin said, nodding toward the woman. "She keeps this ship running better than it has any right to, and that's Owen, our pilot. Don't mind him, he stares at everything new, ship included." Owen offered a small wave. "Hey," he said simply. I did not respond. I did not know how to respond. Everything about this moment felt impossible. 3 days ago, I had a Concorde, a home, a place among my people, even if that place was a fragile and threatened one. Now I stood in a metal room among 3 strangers from a species I barely understood, and none of them had tried to hurt me yet. "You're hurt," Colin said, nodding toward my arm. I looked down and realized for the first time that a shard of metal from the crash had cut through my sleeve, leaving a shallow wound along my forearm. I had not even felt it until he pointed it out. Perhaps the fear had numbed everything else. "Let's get that cleaned up," he said. "Come on, this way." He led me through the ship, and I followed, too exhausted and disoriented to consider resisting. The corridors were narrow and lined with pipes and wires that hummed softly with power. Everything smelled of oil and recycled air. It was nothing like the clean, quiet halls of my home. And yet, somehow, it did not feel threatening. It felt lived in. It felt like a place where people actually existed, rather than a place designed to enforce perfect harmony. He brought me to a small room with a medical bed and a cabinet full of supplies. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, still watching him carefully, still waiting for some hidden motive to reveal itself. "This might sting a little," he warned, as he cleaned the wound on my arm with something cold that made my skin tingle. I flinched, but I did not pull away. "Sorry, I know it's not pleasant." I stared at him. On my world, no one apologized for causing pain in the course of helping someone. Pain was simply pain, an unfortunate but understood part of any necessary process. His apology, small as it was, struck me as strange, almost illogical. "Why do you say sorry?" I asked, my translator finally working smoothly enough to form the question, "for something that helps me." Colin paused, glancing up at me with an expression I could not quite read. "I don't know," he admitted. "Habit, I guess. It still hurts, even if it's for a good reason. Doesn't mean I like doing it." I turned the words over in my mind, trying to understand them the way I would once have turned a thought over in the Concorde, testing it against 1,000 other minds for meaning. But there was no Concorde here. There was only me, and this strange, careful man, and his simple explanation that made less and less sense the more I thought about it. He finished bandaging my arm and stepped back, giving me room again. "You're going to be okay," he said. "You can stay here as long as you need. Nobody's going to make you do anything you don't want to do." "Why?" I asked. The question came out sharper than I intended, almost accusing. "Why would you help me? You do not know me. You do not know what I am." Colin considered the question seriously, the way someone considers a question they have never actually had to answer before. I don't need to know everything about you to know you needed help, he said finally. You were drifting in a debris field. Nobody deserves to die like that, not if we can do something about it. I did not understand him, not truly, not yet. On my world, help was never given freely. It was earned through service to the Concord, through proving one's usefulness, through years of demonstrated loyalty. This man had given me care within minutes of finding me, expecting nothing in return, offering nothing but his hand and his strange, quiet kindness. That night, or what I assumed was night based on the dimmed lights throughout the ship, Colin gave me his own quarters to rest in while he slept in the common area. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the metal ceiling, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life, and yet somehow less afraid than I had been in the pod. The silence in my mind was still there. The absence of the Concord still ached like a missing limb. But for the first time since my exile began, I did not feel like I was falling. I felt, strangely, like I had landed somewhere, even if I did not yet understand where that somewhere was, or what it would mean for the rest of my life. I did not know then that this ship, this crew of strangers who owed me nothing, would become the closest thing to a Concord I would ever have again. I did not know that the silence in my mind, the silence my people called a flaw, was about to become something entirely different. I only knew that for the first time in 3 days, I was not alone in a room, and somehow, that was enough to let me finally close my eyes and sleep. I woke to the sound of laughter. It took me a moment to understand what I was hearing. On my world, laughter existed, but it was rare, and it was always shared through the Concord, as a collective feeling rather than a sound. Here, alone in Colin's quarters, I heard it as pure noise, sharp and human and completely unfamiliar, drifting in from somewhere else on the ship. I rose from the narrow bed, my body stiff and sore, and made my way toward the sound. My legs still felt unsteady, but curiosity pulled me forward more than fear held me back. I found the source in a small common room where Dana and Owen sat across from each other at a metal table, cards spread between them, both grinning at something Owen had apparently said. They stopped when they saw me in the doorway. "Morning," Dana said, her tone easy, though I noticed her eyes studying me carefully, the way someone studies an animal they are not yet certain is safe to approach. Or evening. Hard to tell out here. Sleep okay? I did not know how to answer that question honestly. I had slept, but sleep without the Concord felt hollow, like resting in an empty room instead of a warm bed. I settled for a small nod instead. "There's food if you want it," Owen said, nodding toward a counter along the far wall. "Nothing fancy. Ship rations mostly. But it'll keep you going." I approached the counter cautiously. The food looked strange to me, foreign in color and shape and texture, nothing like the carefully measured nutrient paste my people consumed. I picked up a piece of something round and orange, uncertain what to do with it. "That's called an orange," Dana said, watching me with open amusement now rather than suspicion. "You peel it first, like this." She demonstrated, pulling back a section of the thick skin to reveal bright segments underneath. I copied her motion carefully, and when I finally tasted the fruit inside, the sudden burst of sweetness on my tongue was so unexpected that I nearly dropped it in surprise. Owen laughed again, that same sharp human sound. "First orange," he said. "Never gets old watching that." I did not understand why my confusion amused him, but I noticed something strange happening inside myself as I stood there, holding half of an orange, surrounded by two strangers who found simple joy in my unfamiliarity rather than annoyance. Something in my chest loosened slightly, some tension I had been carrying since the moment the elders cast their judgment upon me. Colin entered a moment later, already dressed for whatever work the ship required of him that day. "You're up," he said, his tone warm but not overly familiar. "Good. How's the arm?" "It is healing," I said, testing the words carefully, still unused to speaking so much after a lifetime of shared thought. "Thank you for the bandage." "Course," he said simply, as if gratitude for such a small thing was unnecessary, though he did not correct me for offering it. "Listen, I know all of this is a lot. New ship, new people, no idea where you are or what happens next, so take your time. Nobody's rushing you into anything." I studied his face, searching for the hidden motive I still could not quite believe was absent. On my world, kindness without immediate purpose was almost unheard of. Every action served the Concord in some measurable way. This man's kindness seemed to serve nothing but itself, and that troubled me more than outright hostility would have. "What do you want from me?" I asked directly, unable to hold the question back any longer. The room went quiet. Dana and Owen exchanged a glance I could not interpret. Colin, however, simply looked at me steadily, without offense at the bluntness of my question. "Nothing," he said. "I mean that. We found you drifting and about to crash. We helped. That's it. You don't owe us anything for that." "That is not logical," I said, my translator struggling slightly to convey the depth of my confusion. "Resources were spent. Time was spent. There must be some expected return." Colin considered this for a moment, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed, not in anger, but in thought. "Where you're from," he said slowly, "does everything have to be a transaction? Every kindness has to be paid back somehow?" "Yes," I said simply. "Among my people, all things serve the Concord. Nothing is given without expectation of return. It is how balance is maintained." "Well," Colin said, "out here, sometimes people just help each other because it's the right thing to do. No hidden bill waiting at the end." I did not believe him, not fully, not yet, but I filed the statement away, another strange piece of a puzzle I did not yet understand, another crack forming in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about how minds and societies were supposed to function. Over the following days, I began to observe the crew of the Wandering Light more closely, trying to understand the strange logic that held them together without a concord to bind their thoughts. Dana, I learned, had once worked for a large trading company before some disagreement with her superiors ended in her being blamed for a failure that was not entirely her fault. She spoke of it rarely, and always with a tightness in her voice that suggested old wounds not fully healed. And yet, despite whatever had been done to her, she trusted Colin completely, and worked alongside Owen and the rest of the crew with an ease that suggested deep loyalty, freely given rather than commanded. Owen's story was different. He had once flown for a larger fleet, until an accident during a supply run left him grounded and blamed for damage that investigators later determined was not his doing. By the time the truth came out, his reputation among his old employers was already ruined. He had drifted from job to job until Colin found him and offered him a place on the Wandering Light, no questions asked about his past mistakes. I began to understand, slowly, that this ship was full of people who had been cast aside by the systems they once served, much as I had been cast aside by mine. And yet, instead of drifting apart in their shared exile, they had chosen to come together, to build something new out of the pieces others had discarded. That realization struck me harder than I expected. On my world, exile meant permanent isolation. There was no coming together after being cast out, no rebuilding, no second chance at belonging. Once the Concord erased you, you were meant to fade quietly into nothing, a lesson to others about the cost of deviation. And yet here, on this small and rough ship, exile seemed to mean something entirely different. It seemed to mean the beginning of something, rather than the end. One evening, several days into my time aboard the Wandering Light, I found Colin alone in the small room he used to navigate the ship's course, staring at a display of stars I did not recognize. "Can I ask you something?" I said, standing hesitantly in the doorway. He glanced up, offering a small smile. "Course. What's on your mind?" "Why do you keep them?" I asked, nodding vaguely toward the rest of the ship, toward Dana and Owen, and the others I had met briefly during my days aboard. Dana and Owen. They were cast away by their own people, much as I was. Why gather broken things together instead of finding those who were never broken to begin with? Colin considered the question with the same careful thought he seemed to give everything I asked him. "I don't think they're broken," he said finally. "I think they got treated badly by people who didn't bother to understand them. That's different from actually being broken." "But they carry wounds," I pressed. "Does that not make them less useful, less reliable?" "Everybody carries wounds, Vesa," Colin said, his voice gentle but firm. "The people who pretend they don't are usually the ones you can't trust. Dana and Owen, they know what it's like to be thrown away by people who should have valued them. That makes them better at valuing each other now, not worse." I sat with his words for a long time after that conversation ended, turning them over in my mind the way I once turned conquered thoughts over among 1,000 other minds, searching for their true shape and meaning. My people believed that individuality was a wound, a flaw to be corrected or removed entirely if correction proved impossible. Humans, it seemed, believed something almost the opposite. They believed that the wounds individuality sometimes caused could become a source of strength, if the right people chose to stand beside you afterward instead of leaving you to fade alone. I did not know yet whether I believed this myself. 3 days without the Concord had left deep cracks in everything I once understood as truth. But for the first time since my exile began, I found myself wanting to understand this strange human way of thinking, rather than simply enduring it until I could return to something more familiar. There was no going back to something more familiar, of course. My name had already been erased from the Concord's shared memory. Whatever life I built now would have to be built here, among these strange, kind, wounded people who had chosen each other despite everything that once tried to keep them apart. The thought should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, standing in that small navigation room, watching unfamiliar stars scroll slowly across Colin's display, I felt something I had not expected to feel again after my exile began. I felt something close to hope. Weeks passed aboard the wandering light, though I measured time differently now than I once had. On my world, time was marked by Concord cycles, shared moments of reflection experienced by every mind at once. Here, time was marked by small human rituals I slowly began to learn. Meals shared at the same metal table, shifts traded between Dana and Owen, the quiet hours Colin spent charting courses through empty space. I struggled more than I expected to with something the crew seemed to take entirely for granted, choosing things for myself. It began small. Dana asked me one morning what I wanted to eat, gesturing toward the modest supply of rations and fresh goods they had picked up during a recent stop at a trading post. I stared at the options, paralyzed by a question that should have been simple. "I do not know," I admitted finally. "Tell me which is correct." Dana frowned slightly, not with judgment but with confusion. "There's no correct, Vesa. Just pick what sounds good to you." "But how do I know what is good?" I asked, without the Concord to confirm it. She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, as if she finally understood the depth of what I was struggling with. "Nobody's going to confirm it for you," she said gently. "That's kind of the point. You get to decide, just because you want to. That's allowed here." It was allowed. That phrase repeated itself in my mind long after the conversation ended. On my world, nothing was simply allowed. Everything was either required by the Concord or forbidden by it. The idea of a choice existing purely for my own preference, with no larger purpose attached to it, felt almost dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff with no one holding my hand. And yet, over time, I began to practice it anyway. I chose foods based on taste rather than nutritional efficiency. I chose which small tasks aboard the ship I wanted to help with, sorting cargo, cleaning equipment, assisting Dana with minor repairs, simply because the work interested me, not because any authority demanded it. Each choice felt small, almost meaningless on its own, but together, they began to form something I had never possessed before. A sense of myself, separate from any collective, standing on my own for the first time. It was during one of these quiet evenings, helping Dana repair a damaged panel in the engine room, that I finally spoke aloud about Tarn for the first time since my exile began. Dana noticed something was wrong before I said anything. She always seemed to notice things others missed. A skill I later learned came from years of watching for danger signs among crews who did not always have her best interests in mind. "You've got that look again," she said, not looking up from the wiring she was carefully reconnecting. "The one you get sometimes, like you're somewhere else entirely." I hesitated, unsure whether to share something so deeply painful with someone I had known for such a short time. But something about the quiet hum of the engine room, the steady rhythm of Dana's work, made the words easier to release than they had ever been before. "There was someone," I said slowly, "before my exile. His name was Tarn. He was younger than me, and his mind carried a flaw worse than my own. The elders decided to unweave him, to erase him from the Concord and cast him away, alone." Dana paused her work, giving me her full attention without pressing me to continue faster than I was ready for. "I tried to stop them," I continued. "I told them that flawed minds could still serve, could still belong. I offered myself as proof. They did not listen. Tarn was cast away before I could finish speaking. I never learned what became of him. And that's why they came for you next," Dana said quietly, understanding settling into her expression. "Yes," I said. "They decided that if I would fight the Concord's judgment once, I would fight it again. They were not wrong, but it did not matter. My defense of him made no difference. He was still cast away, and now I carry the shame of failing him, along with the shame of being cast away myself." Dana set down her tools entirely, turning to face me fully. "That's not shame, Vesa," she said firmly. "That's grief. There's a difference. You tried to help someone who needed it, even though it cost you everything. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of." I did not know how to respond to that. On my world, failure carried only shame, regardless of the intentions behind it. The idea that failed effort could still hold value, still be honored rather than condemned, was another crack forming in the foundation of everything I once believed. "Do you think he survived?" I asked quietly. "Wherever he was cast away to?" Dana considered the question carefully before answering. I don't know, she admitted, but I know this. If he ended up finding people even half as good as this crew found for you, then yeah. I think he had a real shot. Her words offered a small, fragile comfort I had not expected to find. I held on to it carefully, the way one holds something precious and easily broken. Colin found ways, in the weeks that followed, to help me rebuild myself without ever pushing too hard or too fast. He never told me to simply move past my grief, never demanded that I explain myself fully before he offered his help. Instead, he gave me small tasks, small rituals, small pieces of a life I could shape according to my own preferences, rather than the Concorde's judgment. He taught me to cook a simple meal, guiding my hands through unfamiliar motions with more patience than I felt I deserved. He showed me how to chart stars using human navigation methods, explaining the strange and beautiful mathematics that guided their ships through the dark. He even insisted one evening that I join the crew for something called a movie night, during which we all gathered in the common room to watch a story projected onto a small screen. A story so poorly made that Owen and Dana spent most of it laughing at its flaws rather than following its plot seriously. I did not understand the appeal at first. On my world, entertainment served specific purposes, reinforcing Concorde values or celebrating shared achievements. This strange human film seemed to serve no purpose at all beyond simple enjoyment, and yet, sitting among the crew as they laughed together at its clumsy mistakes, I found myself laughing too, a sound I barely recognized as my own. Slowly, without fully realizing it was happening, I began to speak up more often, to offer opinions rather than simply absorbing the opinions of others. I disagreed with Owen once about the best route through a nearby asteroid field, and when my suggestion proved correct, he simply nodded and adjusted course without complaint or resentment. I argued with Dana about the proper way to organize the ship's cargo hold, and though she initially resisted my suggestion, she eventually admitted my method worked better than her own. Nothing terrible happened as a result of these small acts of defiance. No elder appeared to punish me for speaking against another's judgment. No Concorde voice condemned me for daring to hold an opinion of my own. Instead, the crew simply listened, considered, and sometimes agreed, treating my voice as one worth hearing rather than one requiring correction. The true test of everything I had begun to rebuild came without warning, during what should have been a routine supply run to a small trading outpost near the edge of human-controlled space. We had barely docked when Owen's voice crackled urgently over the ship's internal communication system. "We've got a problem," he said, his tone tight with tension I had learned to recognize as genuine danger rather than simple frustration. "Pirates. 3 ships, closing fast. They must have been watching the outpost, waiting for someone worth robbing." Colin's expression hardened instantly as he moved toward the ship's controls. "How long until they're in range?" "Not long enough," Owen replied grimly. I felt my own body tense with fear I had not experienced since the day of my exile. Fear that this fragile life I had begun building might be torn away as suddenly as everything else had been. "Dana," Colin said, already moving toward the weapons controls, "get the shields up. Owen, prep for evasive maneuvers. We're not going to win a fight against 3 ships, so we're going to have to outrun them instead." I stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain what role I could possibly play in the chaos unfolding around me. On my world, crisis was always managed through the collective wisdom of the Concorde, 1,000 minds working together instantly to find the optimal solution. Here, I had only my own mind, the very flaw the elders once condemned, to offer. Then, watching Owen struggle to calculate an escape route through the debris field surrounding the outpost, something shifted inside me. My mind had never synced perfectly with the Concorde because it never stopped working independently, never stopped generating its own paths and possibilities separate from the collective consensus. The elders called this a flaw. But watching Owen hesitate between 2 dangerous routes, I realized suddenly that my mind was doing something his could not, calculating multiple independent paths simultaneously, weighing possibilities the collective consensus of a crisis might have smoothed over entirely. "Not that route," I said suddenly, stepping forward without fully deciding to speak. "The debris field shifts every few moments. I have been tracking the pattern since we arrived. There is a gap forming, there, in 12 seconds. It will not remain open long, but it will be enough." Owen glanced at me, startled, clearly unprepared for my sudden intervention. Colin, however, did not hesitate. "Do it," he said firmly. "Trust her." Owen adjusted the ship's course exactly as I had described, and 12 seconds later, precisely as I predicted, a narrow gap opened within the shifting debris field, just wide enough for the wandering light to slip through, while the pursuing pirate ships were forced to slow and navigate around the obstruction. We broke free into open space moments later, the pirate ships falling steadily behind until they abandoned pursuit entirely, unwilling to chase us further from the resources they had originally hoped to claim. The common room fell silent for a long moment after the danger passed, everyone catching their breath, processing what had just happened. "How did you do that?" Owen finally asked, staring at me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and admiration. I struggled to explain something I barely understood myself. "My mind does not fully sync with collective thought," I said slowly. "That is why I was cast away. But perhaps that same flaw allows me to see paths others cannot, because I am not waiting for consensus to confirm what I already perceive." Colin studied me for a long moment, something like realization dawning slowly across his face. "That's not a flaw, Vesa," he said quietly. "That's a gift. Your people just never learned how to use it properly." I did not respond immediately, too overwhelmed by the weight of his words to form a reply. For my entire life, I had been taught that the gap in my mind, the space that never fully synced with the Concord, was a wound, a weakness, a source of shame I carried without choice. And yet here, surrounded by people who valued exactly what my own people had discarded, that same gap had just saved all our lives. Something inside me shifted permanently in that moment, a final crack forming in the last remaining pieces of everything the Concord had once taught me to believe about myself. I was not broken. I had never been broken. I had simply been surrounded by people who never learned how to see what I truly was. The signal arrived 3 weeks later, quiet and unexpected, catching all of us completely unprepared. I was in the engine room with Dana when the ship's alarms shifted to a low, steady tone I had never heard before, different from the sharp alerts that signaled danger from pirates or debris fields. This tone felt colder somehow, more deliberate, and the moment I heard it, my body went rigid with a recognition I could not explain in words. "What is that?" Dana asked, already moving toward the door. "I do not know," I lied, though some deep part of me already suspected the truth. We reached the bridge to find Colin and Owen staring at a display showing a single ship approaching from the far edge of the system, moving with the smooth, unhurried precision that only Ashari vessels possessed. My stomach tightened with a fear I had not felt since the day of my exile. "They found me," I said quietly, the words falling into the tense silence of the bridge like stones into still water. "Who?" Colin asked, though something in his expression suggested he already understood. "The Concord," I said. "They have come to retrieve me." The ship arrived within the hour, its smooth silver hull settling into a stationary position at a respectful but deliberate distance from the wandering light. A single communication request appeared on our display, and though every instinct told me to refuse it, some deeper part of me, some part still tethered to old habits of obedience, compelled me to accept. The image that appeared showed an elder I recognized immediately, though seeing her face again after so long apart from the Concord felt strange and disorienting, like looking at something simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. Elder Thessa's expression carried the same calm, unshakable certainty I remembered from the day of my exile. "Vesa," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth I had grown accustomed to hearing from the crew around me, only the flat, measured tone of Concord authority. "You have been found. We have come to bring you home." "I was cast away," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the tremor I felt building inside me. "There is no home remaining for me to return to. That was before we understood your survival was possible," Thessa replied. "Exile was meant to end in fading, not thriving. Your continued existence and the strength of your mind's signature has drawn attention among the elders. We have reconsidered our judgment." Hope, dangerous and unwelcome, flickered briefly within me before I forced it down. "Reconsidered how?" I asked carefully. "You may return to the Concord," Thessa said. "Your name may be restored. Your place among your people may be reclaimed, but only under one condition." I already suspected what that condition would be before she spoke it aloud. "Your memories of this human vessel, and everyone aboard it, must be removed," Thessa continued. "The Concord cannot risk further contamination of independent thought within our collective. You will return whole, restored, and free of the noise that once made you flawed." Behind me, I felt Colin, Dana, and Owen tense at the implication of her words, though none of them interrupted, giving me space to face this decision on my own terms. "You are asking me to erase them," I said slowly, "as payment for my own restoration." "We are offering you a chance to belong again," Thessa corrected. "Individuality is a wound, Vesa. It always has been. We are simply offering to heal it." I stood in silence for a long moment, memories flooding through my mind faster than I could process them individually. Colin's hand extended toward me in that first cold docking bay, offering help without expectation. Dana's patient guidance through simple choices I had never been permitted to make for myself. Owen's laughter, sharp and human and utterly unlike anything the Concorde had ever offered me. The gap in my mind that had once been called a flaw, revealed instead as a gift capable of saving lives when independent thought was needed most. "You call it a wound," I said finally, my voice growing steadier with each word. "But it is the only thing that has ever made me feel real. My flaw, the very thing you tried to erase from existence, saved this crew's lives 3 weeks ago. It did what your Concorde's perfect consensus never could. It found a path no one else could see." Thessa's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. Something that might have been surprise, or perhaps discomfort at hearing her judgment challenged so directly. "You have been corrupted by exposure to their influence," she said. "This is precisely the danger we feared." "No," I said firmly. "I have been shown, for the first time in my life, what it means to choose who I am, rather than have it dictated to me by 1,000 minds who never bothered to understand the value of difference. I will not return. I will not erase the people who gave me that chance." Silence stretched across the communication link for a long, tense moment. "You understand," Thessa said finally, her voice cold, "that this choice is permanent. There will be no further offers of reconciliation. You will remain exiled, forgotten, erased from the Concorde's memory forever." "I understand," I said, and I was surprised to find that the words carried no fear within them at all. "I have already begun building a memory of my own, one that does not require your permission to exist." Colin stepped forward then, standing beside me, close enough that I could feel the steady warmth of his presence without him needing to say a word in my defense. He did not speak for me, did not try to argue on my behalf, understanding perhaps that this was a battle I needed to face using my own voice, not his. But his presence alone, solid and unwavering beside me, gave me strength I had not known I still needed. "She's made her choice," Colin said simply, addressing Thessa directly for the first time. "I think that should be enough." Thessa studied the two of us for a long moment through the display, her expression unreadable. "The Ashari do not understand minds that choose isolation over harmony," she said finally. "We never have." "She's not choosing isolation," Colin replied evenly. "She's choosing us. There's a difference, even if your people never learn to see it." Something in Thessa's expression shifted then. Not quite doubt, but something close to it. A crack forming perhaps in her own certainty, however small and fleeting it might have been. "Very well," she said finally. "The Conquered will withdraw. Your name remains erased, Vessa. You will not be welcomed back, should you ever change your judgment." "I will not change it," I said, and I meant every word completely. The Ashari vessel departed within the hour, its smooth silver hull disappearing into the darkness of open space, as silently as it had arrived. I watched it go from the observation window near the bridge, feeling something complicated settle within my chest, as the last physical connection to my former life vanished from view. "You okay?" Colin asked quietly, coming to stand beside me at the window. "I do not know," I admitted honestly. "I have just refused the only home I have ever known. I do not know what that makes me now." "It makes you someone who chose their own future," Colin said gently. "That's not nothing, Vessa. That's actually everything." I turned to look at him, studying his steady, familiar face, searching for any trace of doubt or regret at having supported my decision so completely. I found none. "Why do you care so much what happens to me?" I asked, the same question I had asked him weeks ago, back when I still expected some hidden motive to eventually reveal itself. Colin considered the question with the same patient thoughtfulness he always gave it. "Because you're worth caring about," he said simply. "You always were, Vessa. Your people just never bothered to notice." I did not have words sufficient to respond to that. Instead, I simply stood beside him at the window, watching the empty space where the Ashari vessel had disappeared, feeling the last threads connecting me to my old life, finally, permanently, sever. For the first time since my exile began, that severing did not feel like loss. It felt like freedom. Months passed aboard the Wandering Light, and slowly, without my fully realizing when it happened, the ship stopped feeling like a place I was simply staying, and began feeling like a place I truly belonged. I learned to cook full meals on my own, choosing ingredients based purely on preference rather than nutritional calculation, filling the small galley with smells that reminded me nothing of my old world, and everything of the strange, warm life I was slowly building instead. Dana taught me to repair engine components with steady, patient hands, and eventually trusted me to handle repairs entirely on my own, without supervision or correction. Owen let me help navigate difficult stretches of space, relying on the very ability the Concorde once called a flaw, to find paths through danger that his instruments alone could not always predict. And Colin, quiet and steady as ever, simply continued treating me as someone whose presence mattered, whose choices deserved respect, whose voice was always worth hearing even when it disagreed with his own. I thought often, during those months, about Tarn, the young Ashari whose exile I had failed to prevent all those months ago. The grief of that failure never fully disappeared, but it transformed slowly into something else, something closer to purpose than to shame. One evening, sitting with the crew during what had become a regular tradition of shared meals at the small metal table, I finally spoke the thought that had been forming quietly within me for weeks. "I want to find him," I said. "Tarn. If he survived his exile, he is somewhere out there, alone, just as I once was. I cannot leave him to fade the way my people intended." Colin exchanged a glance with Dana and Owen, though none of them looked surprised by my announcement. Perhaps they had been expecting it for some time, watching the same purpose slowly take shape within me that I had only just found words to express. "How would we even find him?" Owen asked, though his tone carried curiosity rather than doubt. "Space is big, Vesa. He could be anywhere." "I do not know yet," I admitted, "but my people have cast away others before me, and likely will continue casting away others after. There may be a pattern to where such exiles are sent, some record I could access, some trail I could follow. I do not know if I will find him, but I know I must try." Colin studied me for a long moment, something like quiet pride settling into his expression. "Then we'll help you look," he said simply, as though the decision required no further discussion at all. "That's what this crew does, Vesa. We don't leave people behind if we can help it." Something warm settled in my chest at his words, a feeling I had slowly learned to recognize as belonging, the very thing my own people had once tried to convince me only the Concorde could provide. I realized, in that quiet moment around the small metal table, surrounded by people who had chosen me just as freely as I had chosen them, that my people had been wrong about something fundamental. They believed individuality was a wound, a flaw requiring correction, a danger to be eliminated wherever it appeared. They believed belonging could only exist through forced unity, through minds bound together so tightly that no space remained for anyone to exist separately from the whole. But true belonging, I had learned, required exactly the opposite. It required space enough for each person to remain fully themselves, choices freely made rather than dictated, differences valued rather than erased. The Concorde had offered me unity without freedom. This ship, this strange and patchwork family of misfits and outcasts, had offered me something far more precious. Freedom that led willingly back to unity, chosen rather than commanded. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself once again in the small navigation room, where Colin often charted the ship's course through unfamiliar stars. He glanced up as I entered, offering the same small, warm smile that had greeted me on so many quiet evenings since the day he first pulled me from that shattered escape pod. "Couldn't sleep," he said, though it was not quite a question. "Too much on my mind," I admitted, settling into the seat across from him. "I keep thinking about everything that has changed since you found me. I was so certain, that first night, that this ship would be another kind of danger, another kind of cage disguised as rescue." "And now?" Colin asked. "Now I understand that some kinds of rescue ask for nothing in return," I said. "I did not believe that was possible. Before I met you, my people taught me that everything required payment, that no kindness existed without hidden purpose. You taught me otherwise, simply by continuing to prove it, day after day, without ever needing me to understand it fully before you offered it anyway." Colin was quiet for a long moment, considering my words with the same careful thoughtfulness he always gave everything I said. "You did all the hard work yourself, Vesa," he said finally. "I just gave you the space to do it. That's all any of us really did." "That is not a small thing," I said. "Where I came from, space to become yourself was the one thing no one was ever permitted to have." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching unfamiliar stars scroll slowly across his navigation display, each one representing some distant possibility neither of us had yet discovered. I thought about Tarn, somewhere out there in that same vast darkness, perhaps still surviving, perhaps still waiting for someone to finally choose him the way this crew had chosen me. I thought about my old name, erased forever from the Concorde's shared memory, and found that the loss no longer carried the weight it once had. I had a new name now, spoken freely by people who valued it not because the Concorde demanded they do so, but simply because they wanted to. I was still Vesa, But I was no longer only the flawed exile the elders had cast away. I was Vesa of the Wandering Light, a name earned rather than assigned, a place chosen rather than commanded. "Colin," I said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between us. "Yeah? Thank you," I said, for giving me a future I never believed I was permitted to have. He smiled, that same steady, quiet smile that had first greeted me in the cold docking bay all those months ago. "You built that future yourself, Vesa," he said. "I just made sure you had somewhere safe to build it." I looked out at the stars scrolling past the window, thinking of Tarn, thinking of all the other flawed and discarded minds my people had cast away over countless years, each of them believing, as I once had, that exile meant only fading into nothing. I intended to prove otherwise, for as many of them as I could find. My people had cast me away, believing my difference made me worthless, believing my flawed mind deserved nothing but erasure and silence, but a human, asking for nothing in return, had shown me a different truth entirely. Difference was not a wound requiring correction. It was simply another way of being real, another way of belonging, chosen freely rather than forced by 1,000 minds too afraid of change to see the value standing right in front of them. The stars continued scrolling past the window, endless and unknown, full of possibilities I had never imagined possible during my old life among the Concord. Somewhere out there, Tarn was waiting, whether he knew it or not. And for the first time since my exile began, I did not fear the unknown darkness between the stars. I welcomed it, ready to build whatever future came next, one free choice at a time.